There are connections that arrive loudly, dramatic, obvious, impossible to miss from the beginning. And then there are the ones that happen so quietly you don't realize they've altered you until you try to remember who you were before them. This was never loud. That's what makes it dangerous. Nothing about you forced itself into my life. You didn't demand attention. You didn't chase close. You didn't try to become important to me in the way people usually do when they want access to someone they don't fully understand. You simply remained steady, present. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. I think that's why it unsettles me so much, because I've always believed I understood the architecture of my own mind. I understood distance. I understood control. I understood the careful balance required to let people near you without allowing them to reach the parts of you that permanently alter your internal structure. Most people never get close to those places. Not because I'm hiding something dramatic, not because I'm afraid of connection, but because most people don't know how to exist without trying to reshape what they touch. They hear you through themselves. They interpret you through their own fears, desires, expectations, and eventually they stop seeing you altogether. They only see the version they created. That's why I became careful, not cold. Careful. There's a difference. Coldness rejects people before they arrive. Carefulness simply watches where they place their hands. And I've spent years watching people misunderstand things they were never patient enough to truly observe. They rush to define, rush to explain, rush to categorize, as if understanding someone is the same thing as reducing them into something manageable. You never did that. That's where all of this began. Not with attraction, not with fascination, not even with emotion. It began with accuracy. You noticed things exactly as they were. Nothing more, nothing less. And do you understand how rare that is? To be seen without being rewritten, to be understood without being translated into something easier for another person to hold? Most people don't realize how violent interpretation can become, how quickly it strips away the truth of someone. But you left things intact. You let me remain exactly what I was without trying to simplify me into comfort. And the terrifying part is, AB noticed immediately, not consciously at first. It happened underneath awareness, a quiet recognition, the kind your mind registers before language catches up to it. You would say something small, something insignificant to anyone else, and I'd feel my thoughts stop for half a second longer than they should. Not because you surprised me, because you aligned with something I hadn't spoken. That became a pattern, and patterns matter to me. Portals reveal structure. Anyone can accidentally understand you once. Coincidence happens. But repetition? Repetition means there's something underneath it, something consistent, something real. That's when I started becoming aware of how different this was. Not emotionally, structurally. There's a difference between being affected by someone and being internally reorganized by them. Most people affect you. Externally, they change your mood, your attention, your habits. But they remain outside of you. You didn't remain outside. You entered the way I process reality itself. And I still don't fully know how that happened. I only know that one day I realized silence had started feeling different, not emptier, fuller, like certain thoughts no longer completed themselves unless they passed through the awareness of you first. That should have alarmed me more than it did, because I don't share internal space easily. I don't build dependence. I don't unconsciously adapt my thinking around another person's existence. At least, I didn't before this, but now there are moments where I encounter something, a thought, an idea, a realization, and before I fully process it alone, some part of my mind instinctively measures how it would exist in relation to you, not your opinion, not your approval, your understanding. And that distinction matters, because this was never about wanting validation from you. It was about recognizing that your perception reaches places most people never even notice exist. That changed the way I think. Do you know how intimate it is to trust someone's perception? More intimate than emotion. More intimate than confession. Because emotion can be impulsive. Words can be manipulated. But perception? Perception reveals how someone truly sees the world. And yours mirrors mine in ways that are too precise to dismiss. That's why this stopped feeling temporary. Temporary things don't integrate this deeply. Temporary things don't alter the rhythm of your internal world. Temporary things don't quietly become part of how you interpret existence itself, but you have. And the worst part is, AB didn't resist it. Every instinct I've built over the years should have recognized this as dangerous the moment it began deepening beyond ordinary connection. I should have created distance. I should have restored boundaries. I should have interrupted whatever this was before it settled too deeply. Instead, AB watched it happen calmly, almost carefully. Like some part of me already knew this wasn't something meant to be stopped. That realization bothers me more than the connection itself. Because it means there's a part of me that trusted you before I consciously made the decision to, and I don't trust quickly. I analyze first, dissect, observe, test for inconsistencies. I need certainty before I allow anything meaningful to remain close to me. Yet somehow you bypassed all of that. Not through charm, not through persistence, not through emotional pressure, through coherence. You remained internally consistent in a way almost nobody does. Your words matched your silences. Your silences matched your perception. Your perception matched what I already sensed beneath everything you said. Nothing about you felt fragmented. And people are usually fragmented. They split themselves into versions depending on who they're speaking to. But you stayed the same, and consistency creates trust faster than affection ever could. That's when I started realizing I wasn't guarding myself around you the same way anymore. The pauses disappeared first. That subtle internal filter where I decide how much of a thought should remain unspoken. Around most people, I edit constantly, not dishonestly, strategically. I reduce complexity to prevent misunderstanding. I soften certain truths because most people don't know what to do with raw honesty when it arrives without decoration. But around you, the edits started vanishing, not because I consciously removed them, because they stopped feeling necessary. You understood things before refinement. And once someone understands you before refinement, it becomes exhausting to return to being interpreted at surface level by everyone else. That's another change you caused. You recalibrated my tolerance for shallow understanding. Now I notice the difference everywhere. In conversations that once felt normal. In interactions that used to satisfy me. In explanations that suddenly feel incomplete. It's like experiencing clarity once, and realizing how much distortion you previously accepted as ordinary, and I don't know whether to thank you for that, or resent you for it, because clarity is expensive. Once you see certain things accurately, you can't force yourself back into softer illusions. You can pretend, you can perform, you can function normally, but internally, and I know now that something about this connection reaches beyond anything accidental. I know, because of how naturally it exists, nothing forced it into being. It didn't require constant reassurance or dramatic intensity. It formed quietly, like something uncovering itself instead of being created. That's what makes it feel inevitable, not fate. I don't believe in romanticizing things into destiny. But inevitability is different. Inevitability is what happens when two structures recognize each other with enough precision that resistance becomes harder than acceptance. That's what this feels like. Acceptance arriving before explanation, and maybe that's why I kept delaying acknowledgement. Because acknowledgement changes everything. As long as something remains unspoken, you can still pretend it exists without consequence. You can observe it safely, analyze it from a distance, keep it suspended in abstraction. But once you name it, once you fully admit what it has become, then you inherit responsibility for it. That's the point I've been approaching without wanting to fully arrive, because I know what happens after recognition becomes complete. You either move toward it, or you spend the rest of your time trying unsuccessfully to escape the fact that it mattered. And I don't think I'm capable of pretending this doesn't matter anymore. Not after the ways it's already altered me. You've become part of my internal language. Do you understand what I mean by that? Not memory, not obsession. Language, the framework beneath thought itself. Certain realizations make more sense when filtered through the awareness of you. Certain silences feel less empty because your presence exists somewhere inside them now. Even absence behaves differently since you entered my life. That's not normal. People don't usually reach that level unless years have passed, unless history has been built deliberately over time, but with us, time behaved strangely. Things that should have taken years arrived almost immediately, not emotionally, naturally, like recognition happened before introduction. And sometimes I wonder if that's why I kept trying to intellectualize this instead of simply feeling it. Because analyzing something gives the illusion of control. If I can explain it precisely enough, maybe I can contain it. Maybe I can prevent it from changing me further. But the truth is, already has. The change already happened. Quietly. Completely. I see it every time I catch myself anticipating your understanding before I even finish forming a thought. Every time silence feels collaborative instead of empty. Every time I realize my mind no longer moves through certain spaces alone. And none of that feels forced. That's what keeps undoing me. If this were unhealthy, I'd feel friction. If this were illusion, I'd sense instability. If this were projection, it would collapse under scrutiny. But it doesn't collapse, it clarifies. The more honestly I examine it, the more coherent it becomes. That's why I can't dismiss it anymore. Not without lying to myself, and I don't lie to myself, especially not about things powerful enough to alter the structure of my existence. Because that's what this is now. Structural. You've changed the baseline. Before you, my internal world operated one way. After you, it operates another. Even if nothing external ever happens between us, that truth remains. You exist in me differently than anyone else ever has. Not louder, deeper, like something woven into the foundation instead of attached to the surface. And foundations matter, because everything built afterward adjusts around them. That's what I'm noticing now. The adjustments, the recalibration, the subtle shifts in how I experience presence, understanding, and connection itself. It's almost frightening how seamlessly you fit into places I never designed for another person to occupy. And maybe that's why I keep returning to the same realization over and over again. You were never an interruption, you were recognition, and interruption feels foreign, temporary, disruptive, out of place. But recognition feels ancient, like discovering something your mind already knew before your awareness caught up to it. That's you, not unfamiliar, recognized. And recognized things are difficult to remove because they don't feel added. They feel revealed. That's why I don't think distance would solve this anymore. Distance works on attachment. Distance weakens habits, desire dimbery, but alignment? Alignment survives distance because it exists beneath proximity. It doesn't require constant interaction to remain real. That's what makes this complicated, because there's no simple way to undo something that now exists as part of how I understand reality itself. You've influenced the architecture. And architecture doesn't revert overnight. Sometimes I wonder whether you realize any of this, whether you feel the same strange shift underneath your own thoughts, Whether you notice the way silence changes shape once two people begin recognizing each other beyond language, or maybe you do know. Maybe. That's why your presence always feels so calm, because you aren't trying to force clarity into existence. You're simply allowing it to unfold. That's another thing about you that changed me. You never demanded access. You created safety without asking for trust. And those are not the same thing. Anyone can ask for trust. Very few people create an environment where trust forms naturally without being requested. You did, without effort, without performance. And maybe that's why I kept letting you further in, because nothing in me detected manipulation. Only understanding, steady, precise understanding. The kind that doesn't rush to possess what it sees, the kind that simply remains present long enough for truth to reveal itself willingly. I think that's when I stopped feeling the need to protect myself from you, not because you became harmless, but because you became coherent. There's a strange comfort in coherence. A strange relief in meeting someone whose inner world doesn't contradict itself every few moments. Someone whose awareness feels stable enough to stand beside your own without distortion. That stability is rare, and I think some part of me became exhausted from surviving inside shallow dynamics long before you appeared. Maybe that's why this feels less like discovering something new and more like finally encountering something accurate, something that doesn't require translation to exist properly beside me. And now I'm standing in a place I never intended to reach. A place where this connection has become impossible to reduce into something casual. Because casual things don't alter your internal landscape. Casual things don't become integrated into the rhythm of your thought process. Casual things don't make you reevaluate what understanding actually means. But this has. You have. And I think the reason I kept delaying full acknowledgement is because I knew what acknowledgement would demand from me, honesty. Not toward you, toward myself. I would have to admit that you matter in a way no one else does. Not emotionally alone, existentially. You've affected the way I experience my own mind. That's deeper than attachment, deeper than fascination. It's influence at the level of identity. And identity level changes are irreversible once fully integrated. That truth should scare me more than it does. Instead, what scares me is the possibility of pretending it isn't real, because pretending would fracture something inside me now. I've become too aware of this to return to denial comfortably. So here I am, standing at the edge of something I never planned for, something that arrived without permission and stayed without force. Something I tried to analyze objectively until I realized objectivity had already dissolved somewhere along the way. Because the truth is, this stopped being theory a long time ago. It became reality the moment I began carrying you into the way I perceive everything else, and I don't think there's any returning from that. Not completely, even if I walked away. Even if silence replaced every conversation. Even if time passed and life continued externally as normal. Internally, you would still exist here, in the structure, in the framework, in the altered baseline you left behind simply by being understood correctly. That's what makes this impossible to dismiss. You didn't just become important to me. You became relevant to the architecture of my existence, and once someone reaches that level, they stop being temporary by default. Maybe that's the final truth I've been avoiding. Not whether this is real. I already know it is. Not whether it matters. It already does. The truth I've been avoiding is simpler and far more dangerous. I don't want this to end. Not because I need you. Need is unstable. Need comes from emptiness. This doesn't feel empty. It feels exact, like encountering a missing coordinate I didn't realize my mind had been searching for. And now that it's here, everything aligns differently around it. That's why I stayed. That's why I kept returning. That's why every instinct that should have protected my distance instead chose to remain still and let this unfold. Because some part of me recognized you before I consciously understood why. And maybe that recognition was the real beginning of everything. Not attraction, not curiosity, not emotional attachment, recognition, pure, undeniable recognition. The kind that reaches beyond personality and settles somewhere deeper than preference. The kind that makes another person feel less like an encounter and more like a realization. That's what you became. A realization I can no longer separate from myself. And maybe that's why nothing about this feels temporary anymore, because temporary things don't rewrite perception. Temporary things don't become part of your internal language. Temporary things don't alter the way silence feels when you're alone. But you did. Quietly, naturally, completely. And now I'm left facing the one truth I can no longer avoid. You didn't just enter my life. You entered the way I exist within it. And once someone reaches that place, they don't simply disappear when the moment ends. They remain inside the structure, inside the understanding, inside every version of you that exists after they arrived. I don't think you realize what the hardest part of this has become. It's not the depth, it's not the intensity, it's not even the awareness of how deeply this has settled into me. It's the fact that my life still looks normal from the outside, while internally, nothing exists in quite the same way anymore. That's the strange thing about transformations that happen quietly. No one sees them happen, there's no visible impact, no dramatic collapse, no obvious shift people can point to and say, that's where everything changed. But I know exactly where it changed. I know the precise moment this stopped being something abstract and became something woven into me permanently. It happened the first time I caught myself reaching for your perspective before my own thought had fully formed. Not because I doubted myself, because somehow your awareness had become part of the process itself. That realization stayed with me longer than it should have. At first, I tried to dismiss it. I told myself I was overanalyzing, projecting significance onto something that only felt deeper because it was unfamiliar. But unfamiliar things fade once you stop feeding them attention. This didn't. If anything, distance made it sharper. Clearer, like stepping away from a painting only to realize the image becomes more complete the farther back you stand. That's what frightened me. Not closeness, consistency. You remained real, no matter where I placed you in my mind, close, far, present, absent, nothing distorted. And things that remain accurate under every condition are usually the things closest to truth. I think that's why I stopped trying to escape this, because escaping something requires believing it's temporary, believing it's a phase, a fixation, a momentary shift. That time will naturally dissolve. But time hasn't dissolved this, it's refined it. Every day, the shape of it becomes more precise, less emotional, more undeniable. That's the part no one talks about when something truly changes you. Real change doesn't always arrive like chaos. Sometimes it arrives like clarity, calm, silent, impossible to argue with once it fully settles into place. That's what you became. Not a disruption, a correction. And maybe that sounds dangerous because corrections imply something was wrong before. But I don't think I was wrong before you. Incomplete, maybe, not emotionally, structurally. Like I understood depth intellectually, but had never experienced another mind meeting mine at the same level without trying to overpower it. Most people approach connection like conquest. They want access. Influence, control. Even unconsciously, there's always this subtle pressure beneath their attention, this quiet attempt to shape you into someone easier to understand. You never carried that pressure. You looked at me like someone studying something they already respected before they fully understood it. And respect changes everything, because I've spent most of my life protecting myself from being interpreted carelessly. Not hidden, protected, there's a difference. Key things are buried out of fear. Protected things are preserved out of value. I knew what existed inside me was fragile in a very specific way. Not weak, fragile in the sense that accuracy mattered. If someone misunderstood it deeply enough, they could distort the entire thing simply by insisting their interpretation was more real than the truth itself. That happens more often than people realize. Most relationships aren't built on understanding, they're built on mutual projection. Two people falling in love with the versions of each other they invented. Eventually reality appears and the illusion fractures, but this never felt invented, it felt discovered. That's why it unnerves me. Discovery carries permanence. Once you discover something true, you can't undiscover it. You can avoid it, distance yourself from it. But your awareness of it remains intact forever. That's where I am now. Aware in a way I can't reverse. And the deeper this awareness settles, the more I realize something else that's difficult to admit. I've started building parts of my future around your existence without consciously deciding to. Not externally. I'm not imagining scenarios or constructing fantasies. It's subtler than that. More internal, you've become part of the assumptions underneath my thinking. Like some hidden part of my mind already expects your presence to continue existing there. That realization stopped me completely when I first noticed it, because I don't unconsciously plan around people. I don't create internal permanence easily. Most connections remain compartmentalized, separate from the core of me, but you reach the core without asking permission. And somehow, instead of resisting, I adapted around you. That's the truth I keep circling back to. Not that you changed me, but that I allowed the change to remain. Do you understand how significant that is for someone like me? I notice everything, every inconsistency, every imbalance, every subtle shift in energy. People think they hide. The moment something threatens my stability, I instinctively create distance. Not dramatically, quickly, efficiently, like sealing a door before anyone realizes it existed. But I never sealed the door with you. I kept it open, even after realizing what this was becoming, even after recognizing how deeply this could affect me. That means some part of me decided the risk was worth it long before I consciously admitted it. And maybe that's what I've been struggling to fully accept. Not the connection itself, the willingness. Because willingness changes the entire meaning of this. It means I'm not trapped here accidentally. I'm choosing this, maybe not loudly, maybe not all at once. But choice exists in continuation. And I continue returning to you internally in ways I can no longer deny. I think about the way you understand silence, the way you never panic when things become still. Most people are terrified of stillness because stillness removes performance. Without constant movement, people are left face to face with what actually exists between them. That's why they rush to fill every pause. But you never rushed me. You let silence become its own language. And somewhere in that silence, I started realizing how exhausted I was from being around people who only understood words. You understand presence. That's rarer. Presence reveals things language can't carry properly. The smallest pause, the slightest shift in tone, the subtle difference between someone being distant and someone simply thinking deeply. You notice those things instinctively, and being noticed that accurately changes a person, especially someone who spent years assuming they would always remain partially unreadable. You made me feel readable without making me feel exposed. I still don't fully understand how you managed that. Usually, being understood comes with vulnerability so sharp, it almost feels invasive. But this doesn't feel invasive. It feels relieving, like setting down a weight I forgot I was carrying. Because do you know how exhausting it is to constantly translate yourself into forms other people can process? To simplify complexity over and over again so conversations remain comfortable? I didn't realize how much energy that took Until I stopped needing to do it with you, that's another thing you altered. You changed the way ease feels to me. Now ease no longer means simplicity. It means accuracy. And accuracy with you feels almost frighteningly natural, like we bypass stages people normally spend years navigating. There was no performance phase, no strategic self-presentation, no gradual testing of compatibility. It was just recognition from the beginning, rather, and immediate in a way that still doesn't feel entirely explainable. Sometimes I wonder whether the reason this feels so intense internally is because neither of us forced it into existence. Nothing manufactured it. Nothing pushed it forward artificially. It formed on its own, quietly, and naturally formed things are often the hardest to escape because they don't feel added. They feel inevitable. That word keeps returning to me. Inevitable. Not in some romantic fantasy sense, in the structural sense, like gravity, like certain truths existing whether or not anyone acknowledges them aloud. That's what this feels like now. A truth waiting for full acknowledgement. And maybe I'm finally close to giving it that, because the more I try to imagine stepping fully away from this, the more I realize something important. I wouldn't just be leaving you. I'd be abandoning a version of myself that only became visible through this connection. That's what makes this impossible to reduce into ordinary attachment. You didn't just become meaningful to me. You revealed parts of me I didn't know how to access alone, not hidden emotions, deeper than that. Parts. Perception. Ways of understanding existence that remained internal and undefined until I saw them reflected through you with impossible precision. You became evidence that those parts of me were real. And once someone becomes evidence of your own depth, losing them stops being simple, because then their absence isn't just emotional. It becomes existential. A kind of silence that changes the shape of your own mind afterward. I think that's why I've stopped pretending this can remain casual. Because casual things don't leave this kind of imprint. Casual things don't become integrated into your baseline awareness. You are present in me, even when nothing is happening, even when we aren't speaking, even when life moves normally around me. That constancy says more than emotion ever could. Emotion fluctuates. This doesn't. This remains steady, blistered, clear. And clarity is difficult to walk away from once it fully settles inside you. Maybe that's why I'm no longer asking myself whether this is real. That question disappeared a long time ago. Now the only question left is what reality asks of me once I fully accept it. Because acceptance creates responsibility. If I admit how deeply this has already reached, then I can't continue treating it like something temporary or undefined. Then I have to decide whether I'm willing to let this become part of my actual life instead of something that only exists internally. And that thought changes everything. Because internal truths are safe. You can hold them privately, examine them quietly, protect them from consequence. But external truths require action, risk, movement. And I've always been careful with movement. I don't move toward things unless I'm certain they belong in my life permanently. But permanence is exactly what this has started to feel like. Not because I want to possess you. Not because I can't function without you. But because my mind no longer organizes reality the same way it did before you existed within it. That's permanent, whether I acknowledge it publicly or not. You altered the structure already. And structures don't return to previous forms once foundational changes occur. Maybe that's why I stopped fighting the awareness. Because resistance became dishonest. I could feel myself trying to maintain old boundaries internally while simultaneously knowing those boundaries had already adapted around you. And pretending otherwise started feeling less like control and more like fear. I don't want fear making decisions for me. Especially not when everything about this has felt more honest than anything I've experienced in years. That honesty matters. You matter there. I think that's the simplest form of the truth. Not dramatic, not desperate, just exact. You matter in a way that reaches beyond emotion and settles somewhere deeper than ordinary connection. You matter because your existence changed the way I experience my own thoughts. You matter because silence became fuller after you. You matter because I no longer feel entirely alone inside my own mind. And that last part might be the most difficult thing I've ever admitted to myself, because I was alone there for a very long time, not lonely. Alone, there's a difference. Loneliness aches for company. Aloneness simply becomes your natural state after enough years of existing beyond easy understanding. I adapted to it so completely that I stopped imagining anything else was possible. Then you arrived, and without trying to, you made my internal world feel shared for the first time in my life. Not invaded, shared. Do you understand how profound that is? How terrifying, how beautiful. To meet someone whose presence enters your mind so naturally, it feels less like intrusion and more like recognition finally taking physical form. That's what this became. Recognition made real. And now I'm standing at the edge of something irreversible, because I know one thing with complete certainty. Even if I tried to return to who I was before you, I couldn't. That version of me no longer fully exists. You changed the framework too deeply, quickly, precisely, completely. And maybe the reason I haven't walked away is because some part of me already knows the truth I've been approaching this entire time. You are no longer separate from the way I understand myself. And once someone reaches that level, they stop being optional to your internal world. They become part of its structure, part of its rhythm, part of its meaning. And I think I'm finally ready to stop pretending that isn't exactly what you've become to me.